morning, Allen Temple friends and family. We are back once again for another edition of Theological Thursdays. We are live for part 2 of the aftermath, the conversation that we began last week. So it is so good to have you all with us. Share with somebody, let someone know we are on. We are continuing a much needed conversation that began last week. And invite your friends, invite your families, click share, text somebody, call somebody, tell them to join us. They can join us on Facebook. They can join us on YouTube. We certainly invite you all to engage with us in the conversation. Please feel free to ask a question, to make a comment in the chat. We're able to see them, and hopefully we are able to respond. Before we begin, let me say thank you to those of you who are part of our Allen Temple Baptist Church family. We had a wonderful meeting last night with a presentation from our reopening task force. So I certainly want to thank them for their work and thank all of you for joining us. We are on our way to a safe and a healthy return, and I am super excited about it because I miss you, and I pray that you miss us. So for those of you who don't know, Theological Thursdays came about because of the issues of the pandemic and everything that was just being raised and challenging what we believe about God and challenging us in our faith. And how do we deal with the things that we see and experience during this time of pandemic in light of what we say we confess and believe about God? And so tonight is part 2 of a conversation that began last week. Last week, if you joined us, you know that I was joined by Deacon Reginald Lyles along with Dr. Marcus Goodlow, and we had a conversation around the God of justice. It came as a result of the verdict in the Derek Chauvin trial of guilty. And why, as Allen Temple Baptist Church, we have such a focus on justice. It has to do with our theological understanding of who God is. We celebrate God as a God of love. We celebrate generosity of God. We celebrate the saving, the healing, the protective, the provision of God. But we also believe that God is a God of justice. And so tonight, we continue that conversation with some more people who are involved and who are members of our church. And I am so excited to have them tonight. So, ladies and gentlemen, in the chat, help me welcome a few familiar faces that you all should know. I want to welcome tonight first our very own Deacon Michael Holland. Wave your hands so they can see you. Our very own Reverend Dr. Martha Taylor and Sister Lynette Parker. Come on, help me welcome them so they can see you all. Welcome them in the chat. I'm blessed to have them because they are all law enforcement professionals. In addition, they are people of faith. And so I'm interested to hear from them and engage with them around the things that we are experiencing at this time. I'm grateful for Dr. Martha Taylor. As you all know, she's our church historian. So she and I are going to kind of be tag teaming tonight. She'll play multiple dual roles. But by way of starting, I want to start with you the way we started last week. So before we kind of get into the conversation, can you introduce yourselves to the people, for those of you who may know your faces but may not know anything about your background or your person? So let's start with Deacon Holland, since I see you first.
All right. Well, thank you for inviting me to this. I'm happy to participate. I started off, my background starts off back in the 1970s, throwing rocks at the tan and white police cars of the Oakland Police Department. And I ended up retiring, 45 years later as the deputy chief of the Oakland Police Department. I've done a lot of different things. I also ran the Housing Authority Police Department as chief and took them through national accreditation. And I was actually 80% through that process with OPD when the Riders thing happened. And they decided to scrap the national accreditation to do the settlement agreement. So OPD still is not nationally accredited.
Wow. And I also, for those of you who do not know, Deacon Holland, you are also actively working as a part of the Reimagining the Police Department Task Force. I guess you all are. Maybe
yes, I'm on the advisory board.
We'll get into that maybe a little bit later. Sister Lynette.
Hello. I've been a member of Allen Temple. I got baptized in 1981. My family, we've lived various places, but I started my law enforcement career 23 years ago. I started as a civilian employee and then went into the process of going through the academy. About 7 years ago, I was promoted to sergeant, and at my police department, I was the only female Black sergeant. So I was very clear about the expectation that I had for myself, for the community, and how I wanted to navigate that relationship. So I thank you for the opportunity, because after 23 years, I feel like I have a little bit to contribute to the conversation compared to everybody else, but it's a different perspective. Mm-hmm. So thank you for the opportunity.
Absolutely. We're glad to have you. And after 23 years, you have a lot to contribute to the conversation and perspective. So thank you for being here. And Dr. Martha C. Taylor, we know you as many things, but there may be folks who do not know that you also have a law enforcement background as well.
Thank you, Pastor, for the introduction. And you're right. People see me in my pastoral role. I am an ordained minister at the Allen Temple Baptist Church, and I have served in the field of police, having risen from the rank of officer, sergeant, up to lieutenant prior to me going into another field. I might say that I was the 25th woman in the state of California to be sworn in as a police officer and not police woman. There is a distinction, because police woman meant that you were relegated to certain fields, whereas police officer meant you had to get out there, ride the street, do everything that the guys did. And back then, it was not always a pleasant situation, as Lynette alluded to, for women in policing.
Well, I certainly thank all of you for being here tonight, all of you trailblazers, and all of you in your own right, trailblazers. And I want to begin the conversation for the people who are joining us tonight. There always has to be a scriptural text. We have to ground the conversation in something theological, something biblical, so people will understand that if we cannot connect our faith and our theology to what we experience in the real world, then we are challenged. So the one scripture that always comes to mind whenever we are thinking about justice, you all have heard it, I am sure, but we're going to lift it again for you tonight. There are many, but in Micah, in the Old Testament, because they tended to weigh very, very heavy on the side of justice, it shows up differently in the life of Jesus around Matthew 25. But Micah chapter 6, if you're a part of Allen Temple, you've heard it over and over and over again. And it says, what does the Lord require of you? Require of us? And I'm sure some of you on here could fill in the blank. It says what? To love mercy, to act justly, do justice, and walk humbly.
Yeah.
And so some of the challenge around that doing justice part, particularly in this day and time, can be a struggle for folks. So by way of introduction, I want to just ask some of you as law enforcement professionals, what was your reaction to the verdict? And here's why I asked. I was in Rio Vista with my mom, and if you all know Rio Vista, then you already know, right? So there are a few of us, we know where one another lives, right? All of that. Okay. So after the announcing of the verdict, and I'm getting ready to leave, actually to come back last week to do Theological Thursdays, my sister points to her neighbor's home and says, "Oh, what's that?" Because he had hung a flag outside of his home. And it wasn't a traditional flag. It was a flag that was blue and white, and it had a black stripe. I hadn't seen it before. So I took a picture of it, because that's who I am. I drove past this house, took a picture. Okay, get me later. And so I Googled it, and it was they told me, the internet said it was a Blue Lives Matter flag. And it gave the definition of Blue Lives Matter and supporting those who were in law enforcement. But I found it interesting that it was placed right as the verdict came out. And so I'm wondering, I always wonder, particularly for African-American officers, understanding that it feels like there's this blue-black divide, if you will, this us against them. And what is that like for African Americans who were in the department? So what was your reaction as law enforcement professionals? We don't have to all talk.
Yeah, for me, my reaction was it was a sigh of relief, knowing that this was brought to the attention of the whole entire world, and finally, since 1955, all these things have been happening to Black people so many times over and over again. You hear these stories, but thank God we had cameras. We had people that were able to actually step up and want to come forward with their witness statements. And we had a jury that was open-minded. So it really was a sigh for me to say, okay, we could potentially be going in the right direction.
Deacon Holland, why don't you go next?
I was a bit surprised that they got guilty on all 3 counts. But it was the differences between the laws in that state and ours is what really made the difference. When I actually read the actual text of those 3 charges, then I understood why, and I was quite pleased, actually.
Well, let me just say a word on that. When the verdict was read, I had such mixed emotions. I started to cry. I could hardly express myself. It was like I was certainly happy about the verdict. Unbelievable? Not altogether, because to me, the evidence was overwhelming. So I was not surprised. All of 3 of us understand that when we make a charge, we have to ensure that something is going to stick. You just don't charge with emotions. You have to charge to ensure that the elements fit the crime. And indeed they did. So I was happy. I was so happy to see the prosecution present their case in a very unwavering way.
Yes.
Pastor, you asked about the blue.
It seems like oftentimes that there is, I call it a blue-black divide, where it seems
Right.
like particularly officers of color, African-American officers, are forced to choose between the camaraderie that's been established with the persons that they serve with every single day, where literally you are placing your life in the hands of another individual that may or may not look like you.
Yeah.
And the community that you've come from and that you've been called to serve. And so whenever there is a shooting, whether it's Ma'Khia Bryant, whether it's Daunte Wright, whether it's George Floyd, right? The list goes on and on, Ahmaud Arbery, all of that. It seems, I wonder if the people are wondering what position that places you all in as law enforcement professionals. These are the people I work with. These are my colleagues. And yet this is my community. And it feels like there's always a divide, that you either have to choose, I am an officer, or I am an African American, or I'm on the side of the community. And so as those of us who are looking in, it becomes a challenge because we don't know how to react and respond to those who are of us and among us who do this work.
If I may comment, just go back a ways prior to the verdict on Chauvin. And let me go back to the times that I actually was in law enforcement, because I am retired from that field. And that's during the time that the O.J. Simpson case was going on. And when that verdict was read, I mean, I was at work and I'm around a lot of people that don't look like me, so I had to contain myself. But when I went back to my office, which faced the parking lot, one of the members within the police department had drawn a bullet hole on the window that would be pointed. I guess they had gotten in my office, sat down, that was pointed directly at my forehead. I knew who it was. Being the person that I am, and I think most of you know who I am, I'm an outspoken person. That's why I love justice. I'm not ashamed of it. I called a meeting and I addressed that. I let them know that a crayon couldn't kill me. But one thing I have is that I have rank over each and every one of you. And I mean, I had to walk that line to establish what I would do, when I found, without any further delay, who the culprit was. So even we sometimes to everyone that's listening, we have to channel our feelings sometime, because you're always considering who you are first as a Black person, and secondary, you are working in a field that is predominantly, white, and we should not, shy away from it. Their feeling is not the same for us collectively. I'm not going to speak that it doesn't revolve individually, but
I can say for myself, I think every Black officer that I work with, we all had to decide during our shifts, during our career, during our time in law enforcement, how are we going to show up and serve the community and support them and advocate them and dance this fine line that is blue. And I think it is more emotionally stressful and trying to maintain who you are and serving this culture. It's not the police department. It's not the mission statement. It's not the guidelines, the policies, the procedures. It is the culture that allows this type of mentality and this type of behavior. I've had the same situations, but not as egregious as what you experienced. When I got promoted to sergeant, I had people literally tell me, you know why you got promoted, right? It's because you're a double minority. And I had to tell them, if that's what allows you to go to sleep at night, then I need you to continue to think that. Because if you want to know why I got promoted, my door is open. It's just one of those things where it was clear to me that the community was my priority. And I did everything that I could to serve the community. And of course, just like you, Reverend Taylor, there were people that thought your allegiance should have been to the police department and not to the community. We're here to serve and protect.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I found it difficult at times. But what really upset me or bothered me the most is when I would try to address something and then have another Black officer tell me to relax. In a command meeting, I'm deputy chief, and I have a white officer talk about addressing the burglary problem downtown Oakland by putting pressure on the Ewoks and night crawlers. And I'm like, excuse me, Lieutenant, what are Ewoks and night crawlers? And he starts to explain that it's the homeless and the drug addicts. And I go, since when at the Oakland Police Department do we allow for the dehumanization of people? And I have a Black chief of police tell me, calm down, Mike. We're just having some fun. It's hard. It gets really hard to hold your ground when somebody with the same skin color as you, who's your boss, tells you that basically be quiet. That was probably one of the hardest moments in my career.
The reason why it came up, and maybe Dr. Taylor, you can relate to this, is because whether we want to admit it or not, whenever anything happens with a person who is in our field, so I will speak for me, when there is a clergy person who has fallen in whatever capacity, whether it has to do with finances, whether it has to do in their relationship, whether it has to do with some kind of personal relational transgression, we all feel it because the critique comes on preachers. And this is why the church is no good. And this is why pastors are no good. And this is why preachers are no good. And this is why. And so even if you are one of the ones who is trying to do good and trying to walk the straight and narrow path, if you are human, you feel something.
Yes.
And so I was concerned because I know we have members, we have people we are connected to that are members of law enforcement community. And where do you go to be able to say, I had somebody draw a picture on my window with a bullet pointed at my head. I had somebody question the fact that I had been promoted because I was Black and I was a woman. I had another officer who was of my skin tone to tell me, to calm down and not deal with the very blatant dehumanization of the people we've been called to serve. And so it's these kinds of experiences that's kind of driving what with this new generation, this whole Dr. Taylor abolish the police. Just, and it means different things for different people. You know, for most people, when they hear it, they react to the term because they think, okay, we're just going to end police departments, period. And who am I going to call when, you know, they break into my car or when somebody snatches Mother Williams' purse? But no, we're talking about looking at systems and structures and things that need to be changed at their root in order for us to have the kind of policing system, even if we refer to it as that enhances the community and can work in partnership with the community. But you all, some of you are present law enforcement professionals, you are past. What is your reaction to even that concept of just abolish it, or excuse me, Deacon Holland, reimagine it?
I think there's a lot of room for improvement. And, you know, out of the task force, there's 120 different recommendations. My biggest fear out of all of that is that it's just way too much to try to do in what folks want to get done in a year or two. But I believe that 95% of it is valuable information. The CAHOOTS program, macro program, which will move police out of response to mental health issues, those kinds of things, I am 100% for. I did have some real trepidations and about the idea of we'll no longer have police officers respond to domestic violence or to sexual assaults, and I'm like, wait a minute. You know, we don't want to go back to the 1950s when domestic violence was treated as though it was a private matter and just keep the police out of it. We don't want to go back there. Fortunately, those recommendations did not last scrutiny. But I think that there's some really good things going on and some good ideas about how to improve things. The part that I'm still concerned about is the selection and training of personnel. I'm going to say something that most law enforcement officers are going to be really upset with me about. But this attitude of, I got to pull a gun out on everybody, says to me that there is a lack of courage. And that lack of courage is what causes a lot of these people, young Black men, to be shot because these guys are scared.
I'll give you a different perspective. I agree with you. There are a lot of scary police officers. I think all of us have seen them, and we've all had to cover them and be there with them. But a different perspective that I saw at my department was just a lack of interest. There was no vested interest in the community, building bonds, forging relationships. And I attribute that to what I considered a commuter cop. We had people from Winters. We had people living in Sacramento. People living past San Jose. They would drive in their vehicles and they would do whatever they needed to do for 10 hours. And that was it. And if they wanted overtime, then they would, show up. But it was literally about a paycheck. I lived 12 minutes from my police department. When I would go to calls, the people that I see, they're my family, they're my friends. One of the things that God has blessed me with is feelings. And I really empathize and sympathize with people. So when I would see somebody that looked like my aunt or looked like my cousin, I could build a bond quicker. And not having the interest in the community and just putting on a Band-Aid, I think is what causes a lot of these officers to be detached. So detachment also causes desensitization. And is that a word? They are desensitized.
It's a word.
Okay. Big Mama would have covered me on that one. But the warrior mentality, instead of having a guardianship over the community, I think comes with the distance and the interest.
I agree. And it's interesting that you say that, both of you. Thank you so much for your response, because I remember when I was teaching in Oakland Public Schools, there were so many incentives to try and attract teachers to move to the city. They would, give you grants to put a down payment on a home and because there is something to becoming a part of the community. When I moved to DC, and I would go to Maryland, and I would go to Virginia, and the police departments would show up in communities, and the kids would run out of their homes and play. I was fully grown, and I was still terrified, because in Oakland, that was not my experience. The first introduction to the police department I had was from my mother, which basically said, you need to learn to obey me in the house, because if you go outside of the house and you disobey, they will kill you. That was literally my introduction. So it was not, they are your friends. They live down the street from you. They are your partners. And so I do agree with you that is certainly something that we need to take a look at. But Dr. Taylor, I'm going to pass the baton to you in terms of questioning. But the other thing I want to lift up is the role of training. Because Regina Jackson and I were called to intervene with the Alameda Police Department for the city of Alameda when they were protesting kind of at the height of the George Floyd issue and the other murders that had taken place around that time. And young people in Alameda, which I've lived here most all of my life, I'd never heard of kids in Alameda protesting, but they did because of issues that had taken place there. And so there was a divide. They wanted to bring people outside to have that conversation. So they called her, she called me, will you come? We went. The chief of police was there, and one of the things that he mentioned was he had joined the force when he was 23. He went through his initial training, and now he is well into his 50s, having gone through many life changes, and basically admitted that there was no other formal training that had taken place between 23 and where he is now. And so if that's the case, and you always encounter people in a crisis moment, how do you not develop an idea of who they are and who they must be if you don't live there, if you are not involved in their good moments, in their happy and their joyful moments, if everything is a crisis when you are called? How do you not develop some of those preconceived notions and stereotypes that we kind of contend with? So the role of training, was that an issue? Is that an issue? How can we address it?
Well, there's always training that happens every year. I mean, it's mandated by the state, but what's mandated are legal updates and things like that don't really address the issues that officers need to develop the skills for interacting with the people and addressing problems in non-confrontational ways. When they teach in the academy what they call verbal judo or tactical communications, and then they don't bother to even test to see whether or not it works or whether or not you're good at it. But you are tested to find out whether or not you understand the law, and certain parts of the law you have to pass with a 90 or 100% to get out of the academy. But the soft skills, which are really the hard things to do, they don't test on. They don't make sure you know it. They just basically give you here's how you do this. And, if you get a 60% on the test, that's fine. But then they don't really try to do anything with it. Real quick, when Philip Bowling Dyer and Leslie Bowling Dyer were stopped by the police and proned out on Lakeshore, the chief handed that to me and said, "Here, handle it. They're your church members." And what I found was one of the two officers actually did what he was supposed to do, apologized to Phil, but the other officer didn't apologize to Leslie. And when I asked the officer that didn't, I said, "Well, why didn't you apologize? You knew this was not," when you got done, you knew that they were the wrong people. And he goes, "Well, we're OPD and we don't apologize to anybody for anything." And I went, "Where did you learn that crap at?" "Oh, the range master." And I said, I'm like, well, we would have tried to fire him if he hadn't left and gone to San Leandro already.
And
Dr. Taylor, that leads to an issue that you had raised. You said we would have tried to fire him if he had not already left and gone on to San Leandro. And so this blanket of protection that seems to cover even those officers that are out of bounds, where you can just, leave and go somewhere else and start over like it never happened.
Exactly, Pastor. And I think definitely my colleagues here understand, what it means to be covered by the police officer's Bill of Rights. Because when you commit an egregious act within the police department where you serve, you can, resign. You don't have to have that information known for any other agencies. And when you can go from Oakland to San Leandro to wherever, you can draw your current pay from one agency and double dip and go to another agency. And so we really need to understand when we talk about re-imaging, reform, I really would like to see lay people have a deeper understanding of the police officer's Bill of Rights and how they are protected, because police have more protection than the average citizen does. I want to back up on something that we talked about earlier, and that was training. I want to look more at the hiring process before you even get to the training. And some of the soft skills, such as having compassion to people, are not measured. And so we have people that are being hired. Lynette, you referenced that. Commuter police officers. I heard seeing someone in the chat, drive-by police officers. They have no skin in the game. So they just come in, they make their money. They have never worked around Black and brown people. They have never lived next door to them. They have not gone to school to them. But then OPD pays great salaries. And I'm just calling them out, not to say they're the only PD, but please, Oakland makes great money. You come there from these other suburban areas, you get hired, you're smart enough to pass the test, but then you have zero compassion. And your training has always been to see Black people as a threat. And so they start out already that we, the people, are the enemy. And yes, we have read about you, we know about you, and so forth. And I'm very, very bothered by that, as all of you are, and then probably everyone on the line.
I think the other thing, like what Deacon said about training, yes, we have the de-escalation, the tactical communication, we have implicit bias training, but these are all paid advanced officer trainings. They are showing up because they are paid to show up and because it's mandatory. But there's no training, there's no test. This is amongst their team. And usually people find themselves gravitating to like minds when they get on patrol teams. So regardless of what the facilitator is trying to impart on these new hires or on the salty ones that are extremely cynical, it can go one ear and out the other because the unions and because of the Bill of Rights, it protects them. And it will always protect them. I might be saying a little bit too much, but I know of a department that is a stone's throw away from me. One of the officers, they served a search warrant on his house. He had 119 guns. He was an underground firearms dealer. So he sold firearms to over 75 members of different departments in the Greater Bay Area. They let him resign.
Wow.
So he got to go to another police department and he'll pick his pension up from that department when he leaves.
And hopefully,
Exactly.
Dr. Taylor, maybe one thing we can consider as a church in partnership with our Leadership Institute is to maybe have, or even our Sunday school department, have an elective class on the history of policing. I think it,
Ooh,
have people, and maybe tap a Dr. Joy DeGruy and some of you as law enforcement professionals and other folks that we know, so people can really understand the root of it in the Black community. Because Deacon Holland, you will appreciate this. I preach for a church in Atlanta every year. And every year they send me the same security professional from the church to come pick me up from the airport. So we have developed a relationship over the years. I adore him. I will not call his name. He is an officer with Atlanta PD. But the first time he came to pick me up, we were doing a conference in Florida. And so he had flown there. They had lost my luggage, and he took me shopping and said, "Here are the colors. What about this? What about that? Put this on. Come on, you're late. Let's go." And so a few years later was after Trayvon Martin. And so I knew he had a teenage son. He came to pick me up. The verdict had just came out, and I asked him, I said, again, as I've asked you, as an African-American officer, how are you feeling? And he said, I have to be honest with you. He said, every call that comes over my radio is African-American male between the ages of 18 and 35, this height, this. He said, after you hear that so many times for years, he said, oftentimes I can be in the mall with my son and I find myself looking suspiciously at a group of kids who are just standing around because for years, a criminal or a potential suspect has been described as an African-American male between the ages of this and that. And so I kept thinking to myself, and Reverend Tony, I saw your question. This goes to what you raised. She asked about whether or not officers have to take psychological exams. Well, I'm sure they do. Yes, they do. But the question is, after you have encountered 20 to 25 years of trauma every day, it's not whether or not you had to take an exam initially. It is, are you doing something consistently that addresses all of the things and all of the impact that may have on you personally? And that's not even just in the area of policing. That's for clergy too. So, it's some really deep issues that are present. And I was surprised if an African-American officer was able to admit that he is inclined to see his own son's friends as a suspect. Then what does that mean for those officers that are not present? Yeah, I hear you, Lynette. Mm-hmm.
Listen, I had an officer, I had my kids come to the department with me. It was my day off, but I left something in my office. So I had them come. So they're tagging along and people are coming and they're like, oh my gosh, we haven't seen you. We were around when your mom was pregnant, and officers are coming around and, they're shaking hands. And I thought it was really sweet that they had an interest in my kids. Came back to work the next day and I had 2 Black officers say, why would you give your son locks? You know what comes with that. And I said, excuse me? Wow. I said, he is 9 years old. Are you serious right now? And they said, come on, Parker. What does that look like? That's the uniform of the day. Mm-hmm. Wow. I said, really, you guys, you really need to listen to yourself. He's a child and you're already putting my son in a box. They're like, you did it. Oh, okay. Conversation over. And I realized they were lost.
Do you think it is a possibility that they were saying how we are perceived versus them feeling that way?
Yeah, they were saying that this is a perception. Your son fits the uniform of the day, and you have him in jeans, you have him in a t-shirt, and he has locks. Why would you put your son in that? Why would you put him in that uniform? Because you know how he's going to be looked at, and he's a target. And he's 9.
Well,
we get indoctrinated. We get indoctrinated too. We can get caught up in hearing the same thing, running into the same folks with the same demeanor, and begin to address that. My about 6th or 7th year on the department, I'm a crime scene investigator. I'm at probably my 10th or 12th homicide that year, and it's right next to Harvey Wissington's drug house. And I made an assumption that this was just another dead drug dealer. And I said it out loud. And this woman screamed at me and she said, "That's my son. He works for PG&E." And that was the moment that I realized that I started to buy into just the thinking that if this is what it is, this is what it's got to be. And that making assumptions about people without them. For my benefit, I got to go to youth services shortly, about a year later, and it changed my entire perspective on policing. But what we do now, and like at OPD, you've got community police officers. Everybody loves their community policing officers. But then you have the regular patrol officers who do nothing but just respond to 911 calls. They don't get to interact in anything other than that negative way. And they're going to Black, Latino, Asian, they develop those habitual ways of thinking. And the organizations do nothing to try to neutralize that. And when it comes to the psychological testing, yes, they get the MMPI and the CPI. And if they fall within the normal range, then they pass. But when you get to big agencies like Oakland, they don't have psychologists that dig as deep as what I had at the Housing Authority, where I had a psychologist that actually talked with me about each individual candidate before I make a decision about hiring them. There, if you pass the basic tests in Oakland, you get hired. That doesn't dig deep enough to tell you whether this person's a real problem or not, or would potentially be a problem. And so the screening has to, especially for major agencies, it has to increase. There has to be more money spent on it in order to weed out those people that will ultimately become a problem.
Deacon, I have a question for you.
Yes.
In regards to the background process, I know with the shelter in place, I had the opportunity to work in training and personnel. And when they were doing the backgrounds, they were, of course, pounding the pavement. They're knocking on the neighbors' doors. They're going to the old employment, past employers, et cetera. During the shelter in place, and people are just emailing or sending messages, did they actually do the thorough background that they're required to do for new officers during the pandemic?
I really don't have an answer for that. I mean, that's just the past year. So I really can't tell you, but there's a difference between the quality of a really good quality background investigation. And when I would review them, I'd be looking for folks to go far beyond the references. So if you told, if the candidate gave you these 3 references, I want you to get references from those references, and then start asking about who doesn't like this guy, who's got something against him, and then start talking to those people, because the candidate's going to give you, the people are going to give you the most flowery benefit. And if you don't see in background investigations people going to the 3rd and 4th level, digging up additional references, then that's not a good background investigation.
So let me make this hard pivot. I have to make this hard pivot. So first, let me address something in the comment. The question was, is there racism in the police department? Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the blanket answer. Yes. Is it brought to the attention of management? Yes. That was the part 2 question. Is it swept under the rug? Yes. And I dare say the reason why I am answering, I don't want to put anybody in a position, I don't have any problem saying it, but I will say that that's not even a question for us to ask, because we live in a nation that was founded.
Yes.
That's what we need to understand. So when we talk about systemic racism, we are talking about every single structure that makes up what we know to be the United States of America. Our presence here had to do with the color of our skin and the fact that they needed a people in order to build the place. The wealth of this nation was built on the backs of Native Americans and Black folks. So yes, in every structure, education, finance, even entertainment, and policing. So there is racism. And I'm not going to leave it there. The church.
Hello.
So I'm not going to sound off tonight, but what I must do is that we are blessed because you all were members of Allen Temple Baptist Church. So you heard the short man in the kufi every single Sunday get up and preach about social justice and preach about the hard issues that were occurring. You all were there during the tenure when J. Alfred Smith Jr. was there. Same thing. And so how does your faith, did for those of you in times past, does for those of you who are officers now, inform how you do what you do?
I would like to speak to that, as the others will also. My faith has always been my stabilizer, so to speak. I'm one that believe that trouble doesn't last always. And I believe that I have the kind of faith that when I get ready to speak up on an issue, is that somewhere God is with me. And so I am going to say, as many of you know, what needs to be said. And it doesn't mean I'm always right, but I have faith in God that if you are standing on the right side of justice, you may not see the end results in the moment, but I certainly believe that, the right thing will be done, just as it took years. Chauvin and Floyd was not the first case to be videotaped.
Right.
Let us remember that. We saw Rodney King beat to a pulp.
Yeah.
And that still did not do anything. But slowly, a change is beginning to happen in America, up to and including, even having a female vice president. So my faith really sustains me. And my faith in God tells me that when I am supposed to zip my lip, I will. But when it's time to speak up, I just know that deep down, God has my back.
Amen. 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 Others?
I didn't come to Christ until after I was a police officer. I wasn't raised in the church. In fact, Lynette, you and I were baptized the same year in 1981. Actually, yeah, late 1981. And, I struggled for a long time when after accepting Christ as my Lord and Savior, about how do I do what I'm doing, take people's freedom away from them, and how do I reconcile that with forgiveness? And I was lucky to have Deacon Tapley Mills as a guide and a mentor who helped me understand that forgiveness does not mean that you don't hold people accountable. So that sort of helped me. And then my daily prayer when I would get into that police car was, Lord, allow me to do your will in this world in your way. And just try to keep that thought in mind, as this is how God would want me to do this. And, having, I made ethical mistakes. I made mistakes that were things that I responded out of anger, but it also allowed me to recognize when I did make a mistake and try to correct.
Yeah. Yeah. Sister Lynette?
My faith is deep. I think with me, because having to work in a community where there was a lot of churches. So one of the things that I did was I connected myself and I adopted some churches in the community. And that just allowed me to be able to kind of stay connected with them when they were in need. And so I would be able to just show up. And I think that gave a lot of community members the ability to give us pause, because they knew that if they needed an answer or if there was a question, they knew they could come to me. I've been judged a lot on my facial expressions, and I can't see my face. but I do know that kindness resonates. And so God has given me the ability to ask for grace, ask for mercy, and in turn, I show that in my kindness in giving grace and giving mercy to others. It was a beautiful opportunity to be a supervisor because you have to approve arrests. And sometimes people didn't need to be arrested. And, those are those times when you do not approve the arrest, regardless of what that officer thinks he knows or she knows, or how that comes across to other officers. But I just think that God is just so merciful and just so wonderful and amazing that I tried to carry myself in a way that I didn't have to Bible thump, or I didn't have to ask you what church do you go to or what's your favorite verse. No, it's He's in you, He's in me. Let's connect on just an open, transparent way. And God showed up every time.
And I think that's so important, not just especially for those who are in law enforcement, but for those of you who are listening, for all of us. Because you will hear me say, theology is not what we confess, it's what we live. And part of the struggle that we have is that when you confess what you don't really believe, you won't live it. So when you have that discrepancy, when you have that break and that divide, it's either you don't necessarily believe what they're telling you should, or you're having difficulty living it out because you're wondering if it's true. And what the one thing the pandemic has done is it's forced us to wrestle with our own faith without any of the rituals that we are accustomed to hiding behind. Christianity and walking and being a disciple of Christ looks very different when you have to do it like this over a screen, when you kind of have to search the scriptures for yourself because you don't have that luxury of walking into the Sunday school room or walking into the Bible study or traditionally engaging. And so we've established that God is a God of justice, along with all of the other attributes that we know and love about God. And the transition we wanted to make tonight is that the expectation is for us to be agents of justice in our own lives and in our own world, in the way that we have been called to do that. And it's going to look different for each of us. I'm not in law enforcement, so the way I do justice will be different than someone who's in banking, or someone who's in marketing, or someone who's in education, or someone who's in law enforcement. But the one thing that unites us is that it is a call that we all must answer. And we will all encounter a situation where we have the opportunity to pray the prayer that Deacon Holland lifted up. Yes. God, help me today to do your will in your world. Amen. Whatever I've been called to do, whatever area you find me in. We even had it, Dr. Taylor, with the testing people, because when CORE came to our campus, they had been to Haiti and they had been to Rwanda and all these other places, but they had never been to Deep East Open. So I had to say to them, look here, this is not Rwanda. This is not Haiti. We are different kind of colored people out here. And so it was interesting just to see their attempts at cultural adjustment. But I can imagine we weren't able to connect on was we were all human and we were all there trying to serve together. Yes. And so when there were challenges, when there were people who came and they were acting out of their pathologies, when it was 4th of July and they came throwing firecrackers on the tents on campus, we had to say, yeah, that's what we do. When they were, doing donuts on the corner of 86th and 8th Street and they wanted to shut down and testify, no, we don't do that. They'll be gone. Don't call anybody. They'll be gone in 15 minutes. But it takes us being able to have these kinds of honest dialogues. Absolutely. And so, Alan Temple, if you've enjoyed this panel tonight, will you type something in the chat? Let them know you appreciate their transparency and their sharing. Put hearts there. Tell them thank you. Put your questions there. We have a few minutes. We can ask them some questions. I believe we can, Reverend Charlotte. But just let them know it is not easy to be an African American in law enforcement. I can say no, that. It's not. You don't have to say it. I can say it. It's not easy for them to do that. But aren't we grateful that we have persons who are persons of faith and who believe in justice and who Amen. Are wrestling personally in their own walk to make sure that they are serving the community with the highest standard and who are taking a risk who are taking a risk in many ways by even engaging in this way, because isolation is real. So you all see the comments, and so they are appreciated. We always like to leave folks with hope. And so tell me one thing that each of you are hopeful about as it relates to this whole issue of justice. We didn't even talk about probation, Miss Liz. That's a whole nother law enforcement area. So I'm going to commit. You all have heard it from me, Dr. Taylor, hold me to it. We need to partner with either our Sunday school department or the Leadership Institute and have an elective class. Online would be a wonderful time to do it on the history of policing. Can we do that?
Oh, absolutely. And
Okay.
let me say this much out of line. Pastor, you enjoyed this so much until you were going to check out.
I
You
was.
have been
I was going to hit the video button and hit leave, but I did. I apologize. So, okay, the next one's on you. I apologize.
Oh no, we love it. We love it.
When you do the history, please let's set aside a portion just for the history of the Oakland Police Department. It is absolutely fascinating how bad things were, how they got better, and how they got worse again.
Oh,
Well,
absolutely.
listen, I'm going to let
And you have a book.
Yeah, you do have a book. You do have a book, and he has it handy. Look at him. Do you have it handy?
Look at it. Hold your book up.
No.
You don't have your book handy to hold it?
I do not. No.
I have your
I
book.
would say
You
this.
want me to get it?
I would not set the curriculum. I would certainly be leaning on all of you and other law enforcement professionals that we have to help set, kind of what that curriculum would look like. I just commit that we need to have it because people need that deep understanding. So when they hear the news, when they hear activists, when they hear protesters, you'll be able to filter because you have the information yourself. But again, give us some hope. What has you hopeful, Sister Lynette? Sergeant Lynette is probably what I should say. Okay.
Yeah.
The dialogue, having the communication, and just being open to understanding the plight of a Black officer. I appreciate that you called on me to give my experience, because it really is a different experience from any other law enforcement officer. So I'm hopeful that we can continue the conversation and that people can understand why we chose this profession, not that we are turning our back on the community, but all of us collectively actually believed that we were serving and making a difference, whether we did or not. We believed that, and that was our platform.
Amen.
Deacon Holland, what has you hopeful?
I'm hopeful that qualified immunity is going to go away and that the Police Officer Bill of Rights is going to get extremely minimized. There are some things that need to be there, but with the qualified immunity made some sense, but it's been the reason why folks just say and so it needs to go away. I believe there is an opportunity for change in policing. And Lynette, let me just tell you, you made a difference. You made a difference. You may not know how or where you made that difference, but you made a difference. And the same thing goes for you, Dr. Taylor.
Can I just say one thing? When we talk about defunding,
it's getting good.
Yeah, right. When we talk about defunding the police department, one of the things that I've seen is when you have these lawsuits, whether it's the federal lawsuits where they'll sue the police department for wrongful death, anything. The money that goes to the family comes out of the city fund.
Yeah.
It does not come out of the police department's budget.
Not at all.
Yeah.
So they don't see.
They don't feel it.
They don't feel it. They don't see it. So if you're talking about defunding the police department, if you moved that financial burden to the police department to pay out that money, I think people would think twice about wrecking a car or about, some of the things they're doing that are suspect.
Well, listen, I'm not even going to tell you. Well, yes, I am, because you pivoted the conversation, but I'm going to pivot it back, Dr. Taylor. I'm going to ask you to close us with hope and close us with prayer. But I am one of the ones who believe that some officers might need to carry malpractice insurance in the same way that we require doctors to do it, because you would be less likely to mistake your gun for a taser if you knew that you could be personally held responsible for the way that you have mishandled a situation.
Yes.
But that's a whole nother conversation that I will save, because I could do this for hours. So Dr. Taylor, what gives you hope? And then could you close us in prayer? Thank you so much for being with us tonight. Alan Temple, thank you for joining us. We're going to hear this last little bit of hope, and we're going to close out in prayer.
I am going to, thank you, Pastor. I am going to throw it out like this. My hope is that other ministers can see what you are doing through Theological Thursday and catch the fire, catch the burn, as Bernie would say. So my hope is that these types of conversations continue. I have hope in the fact that things will change. I'm not sure I have a total understanding about re-imaging, reform, defunding. All of those verbs seem to kind of go together, but trust me, a change is going to come. And with that, let us go to the Lord in prayer.
Amen. Hi,
Gracious.
Lakeisha. I'm sorry. I saw a member. I hadn't seen it forever. Hi,
That's
Lakeisha.
okay. Look at the pastor. I love her to death. Shall we pray? Gracious and eternal loving God, we just thank you for this day, a day that we have never seen, a day that you created and you brought us into this space and this time. God, we thank you that you have given us backgrounds in law enforcement where we have used it for your glory, because law enforcement does not have to be negative. It's all about how we show compassion, that we understand what your justice is, that we understand what love is. We understand that the second commandment says, after we love you, to love one another, not to go out and to do harm to one another. So God, help us not to grow weak in well-doing, because we're going to reap the benefit. God, I just ask for prayers for our pastor, for her mother right now in the name of Jesus. God, I pray for Pastor Emeritus, who set a bar so high. His standard was so high that years and years ago, he would take groups of people and we would march from the church to City Hall and we would pray along the way. So God, continue to prop him on every leaning post. God, thank you for this opportunity. Bless our church. Bless those in the wider community. In the name of Jesus, we love you and we give it to you because you are a God of justice. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you once again. Good night, Alan Temple. We love you. We'll
Good
see you
night.
again.
Good night.
Good night, everyone.
Make sure you share this.